Assalamualaikum, salam hormat. Anda menyaksikan Niaga AWANI bersama saya Harits Asyraf. Kita mulakan dengan laporan pertama di mana ringgit dijangka diniagakan berhati-hati berbanding dolar Amerika pada minggu ini menjelang mesyuarat jawatankuasa pasaran terbuka Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat pada 28 hingga 29 Januari ini. Ketua Ahli Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad, Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid berkata, jangkaan ramai atau konsensus bagaimanapun mengunjurkan kadar dana Persekutuan Amerika tidak akan berubah.
Selain daripada itu, pasaran akan turut memantau data penggunaan peribadi Amerika Syarikat PCE bagi Disember 2024. Beliau berpandangan ada kemungkinan keadaan lebih reda berikutan pendirian Presiden Donald Trump yang kelihatan tidak terlalu keras dalam mengutamakan kadar faedah lebih tinggi pada masa ini. Trump yang cenderung kepada penurunan kadar faedah membuktikan kurangnya pertikaian antara White House dan pihak Rizab Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat Fed yang akan memudahkan lagi tugas bank pusat itu. Berikutan itu, pihaknya menjangkakan ringgit berpotensi kekal dalam lingkungan julat RM4.37 hingga RM4.38 minggu ini. Ringgit mengakhiri urus niaga Jumaat dengan mencecah paras tertinggi berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat dalam tempoh hampir 3 bulan selepas Trump melontarkan nada lebih lembut bagi isu tarif China selain memberi isyarat mahukan kadar faedah lebih rendah. Bagi asas perbandingan Jumaat hingga Jumaat, ringgit mengukuh berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat kepada 4.3750 daripada 4.5040 seminggu lepas. Ringgit juga diniagakan lebih tinggi berbanding mata wang ASEAN.
Sementara itu, Bursa Malaysia dijangka mengalami dagangan secara berhati-hati minggu ini menjelang sambutan Tahun Baru Cina dan mesyuarat jawatankuasa pasaran terbuka Rizab Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat yang pertama bagi 2025 pada 28 dan 29 Januari. Ketua Pendidikan Pelaburan UOB Kehian Wealth Advisor Sdn Berhad, Muhammad Siddiq Jantan berkata, permintaan dijangka berkurangan minggu ini susulan perayaan Tahun Baru Cina.
Katanya minggu dagangan singkat susulan cuti umum Tahun Baharu Cina mungkin menjejaskan aktiviti pasaran dengan jumlah dagangan dijangka rendah dan pergerakan pula mungkin terhad. Beliau berkata memandangkan musim cuti perayaan Tahun Baru Lunar di China, kebanyakan data utama dijadual dikeluarkan pada Isnin termasuk indeks pengurus pembelian bagi pembuatan dan angka kemudahan pinjaman jangka sederhana MLF. Bagi Amerika, data utama perbelanjaan penggunaan peribadi PCE yang akan dikeluarkan pada 31 Januari dijangka mendapat perhatian. Muhammad Siddiq berpendapat walaupun dasar Presiden Donald Trump banyak menyokong sentimen global, namun ekonomi Malaysia dijangka meraih manfaat daripada asas domestik yang kukuh, permintaan berterusan dari China dan keadaan kecairan global yang semakin baik. Berasaskan Jumaat ke Jumaat, FBM KLCI naik 7.01 mata kepada 1,573.73 daripada 1,566.72 pada minggu sebelumnya.
Okey, baik. Moody's mengekalkan penarafan kedaulatan Malaysia pada A3 dengan unjuran stabil merujuk kepada prospek pertumbuhan jangka sederhana yang kukuh dan kecekapan institusi dasar. Namun, cabaran fiskal masih ketara dengan beban hutang tinggi dan asas hasil yang sempit membatasi ruang fiskal. Dan kerajaan telah berjaya mengurangkan perbelanjaan dan meningkatkan kutipan cukai. Tetapi reformasi berterusan masih diperlukan dan Malaysia berhasrat mengurangkan defisit fiskal kepada 3.8% KDNK tahun ini dan menurunkan beban hutang kepada 63% KDNK. Dan penilaian ini bersama pandangan positif Fitch yang iaitu BBB positif dan S&P iaitu A negatif menunjukkan Malaysia kekal sebagai ekonomi grade pelaburan, tetapi konsolidasi fiskal perlu diperkukuh untuk memastikan kestabilan ekonomi. Jadi untuk meneliti perkara ini bersama dengan saya secara dalam talian Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid, Ketua Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad. Pertama sekali, Dr. Nizam, reaksi doktor melihat kepada Moody's rating yang mengekalkan penarafan A3 untuk Malaysia ini. Pandangan doktor.
Baik, Harits, bagi saya ia adalah suatu perkembangan yang positif kerana ia menunjukkan bahawa suatu pengiktirafan diberi oleh pihak agensi kredit antarabangsa yang mana Moody's telah pun mengekalkan sovereign rating pada tahap single A3 dan juga dengan tinjauan yang stabil. Justru ini menunjukkan bahawa langkah kerajaan dalam memperbaiki kedudukan kewangan berada dalam on track ataupun dalam track yang betul lah. Cuma isunya adalah kalau kita perhatikan dengan apa yang dimaklumkan oleh pihak Moody's, mereka masih lagi meletakkan kebimbangan mereka terhadap kedudukan hutang kerajaan sebagai faktor utama yang mengekang sebarang bentuk upgrades ataupun peningkatan dalam penarafan yang sedia ada. Justru di sini menuntut pihak kerajaan untuk terus dalam melaksanakan langkah konsolidasi fiskal supaya penarafan pada masa akan lebih baik lagi.
Ya, Dr. Nizam, sejauh mana mungkin keberkesanan usaha konsolidasi fiskal Malaysia dalam nak menangani beban hutang tinggi dan juga kalau kita bercakap dalam konteks defisit fiskal ini, bagaimana secara keseluruhannya keberkesanan usaha itu?
Bagi saya keberkesanannya jelas terpancar dengan data yang telah dikongsi oleh pihak kerajaan dan sebagainya dan telah mendapat orang kata tu suatu bentuk pengiktirafan oleh credit rating agency. Tetapi dalam melaksanakan reformasi fiskal dan sebagainya, saya percaya suatu bentuk pertimbangan yang tuntas perlu diambil kira lah. Kerana kalau kita melihat dari segi sudut ekonomi sahaja dan keperluan untuk kata itu mendapat penarafan yang baik, saya rasa pertimbangan sebegitu rupa agak sedikit dangkal lah kerana kita perlu melihat realiti semasa, realiti dari segi kesan kepada rakyat dan juga realiti kepada kedudukan ataupun landscape politik yang kita hadapi buat masa ini. Justru pertimbangan ini menuntut saya kira kebijaksanaan pentadbir ataupun pemimpin kita dalam melaksanakan langkah konsolidasi fiskal ni. Dan di sini saya melihat peranan sekali lagi yang selalu saya sebutkan adalah faktor komunikasi tentang bagaimana kita nak menerangkan kepada rakyat kenapa langkah konsolidasi fiskal ni sangat penting. Dan kalau tidak ditangani dari segi faktor komunikasi, saya percaya dia akan membawa kepada isu-isu seperti kekeliruan, kegusaran dan sebagainya, dan akhirnya akan merugikan kita segi sentimen kerana dia boleh membawa keadaan kedudukan ekonomi ataupun pertumbuhan ekonomi yang sedikit lembab. Jadi suatu pertimbangan dan menuntut kebijaksanaan pemimpin kita untuk melaksanakan langkah reformasi ini.
Ya. Doktor, dalam kita nak bercakap soal mewujudkan ruang fiskal itu, sudah tentu kita perlu melihat kepada pelbagai indikator-indikator. Kalau kita lihat perubahan dasar cukai, antaranya kalau kita antara lain lagi cukai rasionalisasi subsidi, dan menjangkakan bahawa mungkin pada bulan Jun, tapi masih lagi di peringkat ura-ura, kita tidak tahu lagi untuk round 95 dan sebagainya ini. Bagaimana kalau kita bercakap dari segi kemampuan Malaysia untuk, terutamanya kalau kita nak bercakap dari segi sama ada nak membayar hutang ke ataupun dari segi apa yang sedang dilakukan pada ketika ini memenuhi kehendak semasa, termasuk melihat kepada faktor-faktor luaran, cabaran global dan sebagainya ini, adakah kita berada di landasan yang tepat nak mengurangkan defisitnya dan pada masa sama melihat kepada dasar-dasar cukai terutamanya. Kalau belanja ni agak besar tapi nak meningkatkan hasil ni satu cabaran yang cukup besar juga kepada negara, Doktor.
Ya, betul Harits. Itu saya katakan tadi, dia menuntut kebijaksanaan pemimpin kita. Pertama dari segi pelaksanaan dasar, maksudnya kalau kita cakap pelaksanaan dasar sudah pasti dia melibatkan mekanisme yang jelas untuk dilaksanakan supaya bila dilaksanakan dia tidak ada orang kata tu hiccups ataupun tidak ada orang kata tu sebarang bentuk gangguan dan sebagainya, dia lancar saja. Contoh kalau kita bercakap tentang isu berkenaan dengan subsidi RON 95, tentang buat masa ni kita masih lagi menunggu apakah mekanisme akhir yang akan dilaksanakan. Tapi saya percaya pihak kerajaan akan melaksanakannya lah. Cuma kalau kita nak bercakap tentang kebimbangan tentang kedudukan kewangan kerajaan, saya percaya kalau kita lihat komposisi hutang disebut oleh pihak Moody's adalah 63% dari tindakan NK. Betul. Tapi kalau kita lihat dari segi komposisi hutang kerajaan dari sudut mata wang, 98% adalah dalam bentuk mata wang ringgit. Ini bererti kerajaan dalam keadaan yang boleh mengawal sebenarnya kedudukan hutang tersebut, dan risiko untuk mungkir ataupun default itu sebenarnya sangat-sangat rendah kerana hampir 100% hutang tersebut adalah dalam bentuk ringgit dan kerajaan dalam in control lah sebenarnya. Cuma isu yang kita nak tekankan adalah hutang ni sebaiknya direndahkan dan
setiap perbelanjaan yang dibelanjakan tu perlu diperhalusi apakah ROI-nya ataupun return on investment-nya. Dan pasti kalau bercakap ekonomi ni, ROI-nya ada banyak berpaksikan kepada produktiviti. Tapi seperti yang saya sebutkan tadi, langkah untuk membaiki kedudukan kewangan ni sebenarnya secara umumnya tidak popular. Seperti yang Harits sebutkan tadi, dia mungkin akan melibatkan langkah untuk meningkatkan hasil dan sudah pasti tidak bukan dia akan melibatkan cukai dan sebagainya.
Ya, Doktor, sudah tentu apabila mendapat penarafan, sama ada sudah tentu kita mahu mengekal ataupun menjadikannya lebih baik dalam bentuk penarafan itu. Dalam apa-apa situasi sekalipun, dalam kita melihat kelembapan mungkin ekonomi di China, dasar-dasar baharu yang mungkin dilaksanakan oleh Amerika Syarikat, keputusan The Fed juga akan kita nantikan untuk bulan pertama di bawah kepimpinan Trump ini, mungkin ada perbezaan dan sebagainya. Bagaimana Malaysia dapat mengekalkan kedudukannya sebagai ekonomi penarafan, kalau kita bercakap AAA+ itu mungkin jauh lebih baik. Apa indikator-indikator yang mungkin perlu ditelitikan, faktor-faktor luaran terutamanya pada ketika ini, Doktor?
Okey, kalau dari segi indikator, sudah pasti tidak lain tidak bukan adalah bagaimana dasar monetary di peringkat US terutamanya ataupun di Amerika Syarikat akan sentiasa dipantau, kerana dia menjadi suatu barometer lah. Dan indikator yang seterusnya selain pada makroekonomi seperti inflasi, kadar pengangguran dan sebagainya, sudah pasti kita akan melihat bagaimana pasaran keuangan akan bertindak balas terhadap dasar yang bakal dilaksanakan. Dan sudah pasti kita akan memantau pasaran saham terutamanya dan juga pasaran bond. Dan selain itu pergerakan mata wang asing lah. Jadi ini merupakan petanda-petanda ataupun indikator yang sentiasa dipantau. Tetapi kita perlu berhati-hatilah dalam meneliti indikator ini, terutama indikator pasaran, kerana ada wujudnya sentimen pasaran dan mungkin ada wujud aktiviti spekulasi dan sebagainya. Dan di sini ia menuntut untuk melihat faktor fundamental itu sendiri. Dan di sini saya melihat dari segi bagaimana kerajaan untuk menangani masalah ini, saya rasa tidak lain tidak bukan adalah untuk menunjukkan suatu kredibiliti yang tinggi, terutamanya menjalankan dasar yang tidak popular. Jadi kalau seboleh-bolehnya elakkanlah kalau berlaku polisi U-turn, kerana itu akan compromise kredibiliti kerajaan dalam melaksanakan dasar yang bersifat reformis ini.
Ya, mungkin terakhir berbaki lebih kurang dalam 1.5 minit ini, Doktor. Mungkin apa yang perlu diletakkan sebagai contoh keutamaan dari segi pelaksanaan polisi yang kurang popular itu tadi? Sebagai contoh, komunikasi yang lebih baik. Doktor juga menekankan dari segi mengelakkan U-turn dalam sebarang pelaksanaan polisi. Bagaimana terutamanya kalau saya nak menekankan dari segi komunikasi yang baik kepada masyarakat supaya faham sesuatu yang mungkin ia ibarat ubat yang pahit perlu ditelan pada ketika ini, Doktor?
Baik, saya rasa tak lain tak bukan mekanisme itu. Saya rasa kita kalau mekanisme itu diperjelaskan, saya rasa itu akan menimbulkan satu suasana yang lebih kondusif lah, kerana rakyat mungkin akan faham bagaimana ia akan dijalankan, apakah langkah-langkah mitigasi akan dilaksanakan yang akan memungkinkan kesan tersebut dapat diminimumkan. Kerana kita tetap elakkan kesan terhadap kenaikan harga barang dan sebagainya. Tapi kalau kerajaan dah jelas dari segi mekanismenya dan sudah jelas dari segi langkah mitigasinya, di sini akan mewujudkan satu keyakinan lah. Dan seterusnya, setelah kerajaan menetapkan mekanisme itu adalah bagaimana untuk mewawarkan kepada rakyat untuk rakyat akan sentiasa ingat, akan faham dan seterusnya akan mengurangkan risiko sebarang confusion ataupun kekeliruan tentang apa yang bakal dilaksanakan pada masa yang akan ditetapkan nanti.
Ya, sudah tentu penarafan yang diberi oleh badan-badan penarafan global ini bukan sahaja perlu dikekalkan, malah perlu ditambah baik dari semasa ke semasa. Dr. Muhammad Afzani Abdul Rashid, terima kasih, Ketua Ekonomi Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad, berkongsi pandangan beliau berkenaan dengan apa yang dilaporkan oleh Moody's berkait dengan penarafan kedaulatan Malaysia pada taraf A3. Okey, minggu lalu kita telah pun menyaksikan pelantikan semula Donald Trump sebagai Presiden Amerika Syarikat untuk penggal keduanya, dan sudah tentu banyak pelbagai sentimen, banyak juga executive order yang telah pun ditandatangani oleh beliau, dan segala ini akan memberi implikasi kepada sentimen pasaran terutamanya. Kalau kita nak memperincikan melihat kepada reaksi pasaran dan juga ekonomi, juga boleh dikatakan begitu rencam sekali, begitu dinamiknya perubahan pada ketika ini. Dan kalau kita meneliti apa yang dilaporkan oleh laporan agensi berita antarabangsa juga, antara perkara yang dilihat sebagai satu cabaran yang terbesar pada ketika ini adalah melihat bagaimana apa yang dinyatakan oleh Donald Trump sebelum ini sewaktu ataupun dalam ucapan beliau di World Economic Forum, melihat kepada apa yang dinyatakan berkait dengan OPEC, meminta negara-negara anggota OPEC untuk menurunkan harga minyak mentah, dan pada masa sama melihat juga negara-negara yang lain untuk memotong kadar faedah mereka. Ini semua gesaan yang dilakukan oleh Trump dengan alasan bahawa mungkin akan dikenakan tarif kepada negara-negara yang mungkin bertindak untuk melakukan membuka kilang di negara luar dan sebagainya. Jadi untuk waktu ini kita nak melihat bagaimana mungkin reaksi awal ini adalah dari segi pasaran. Seminggu pertama pentadbiran Trump, bagaimana sentimen global yang dipacu oleh pentadbiran Trump 2.0 ini mempengaruhi terutamanya bursa Malaysia, dan juga langkah-langkah yang boleh diambil oleh pelabur untuk mengharungi cabaran ini. Jadi saudara Muhammad Siddiq Jantan, Ketua Pendidikan Pelaburan UOB Kehian Wealth Advisors, bersama dengan saya secara dalam talian. Pertama sekali, Siddiq, bagaimana penggal kedua Presiden Trump mempengaruhi sentimen pasaran global, dan mungkin apakah implikasinya kepada Malaysia?
Okay, kita lihat di penggal kedua Presiden Trump, dia telah membawa tahap optimisme yang lebih terkawal kepada pasaran global, yang seterusnya memberi reaksi positif kepada sentimen pasaran tempatan. Fokus beliau kalau kita lihat kepada dasar pro pertumbuhan seperti pembangunan perindustrian, pengurangan peraturan dan juga insentif perdagangan yang telah meyakinkan pelabur, dan tidak seperti permulaan penggal pertama yang penuh dengan ketidaktentuan, peralihan kuasa, dan kali ini kita lihat ianya lebih stabil, mencerminkan pengalaman yang lebih matang dalam menangani isu politik dan juga ekonomi. Dan bagi Malaysia, kita lihat kesan limpahan adalah bercampur-campur. So dari sudut positif, fokus Trump kepada pemulihan sektor perindustrian boleh meningkatkan permintaan global terhadap bahan mentah, yang secara tidak langsung kita lihat ianya menyokong ekonomi berorientasikan ekspor seperti Malaysia. Namun kalau kita tengok risiko jangka panjang tetap ada. So kita tengok terutama jika defisit fiskal Amerika Syarikat meningkat akibat dasar-dasar ini. Ini boleh mendorong kenaikan hasil pembendaharaan Amerika Syarikat, menguatkan dolar Amerika Syarikat dan memberi tekanan kepada ringgit. Walaupun kami menunjukkan ringgit mungkin melemah, pada minggu lalu kita lihat ringgit mendapat sokongan jangka panjang berikutan keputusan Bank of Japan untuk menaikkan kadar faedah. Ini kalau kita lihat mencerminkan trend serantau di mana kebanyakan mata wang Asia menunjukkan pengukuhan berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat seiring dengan ketahanan ekonomi rantau ini.
Ya, Siddiq, mungkin bagaimana pergerakan FBM KLCI untuk minggu lalu, dan apa yang boleh dijangkakan pada minggu ini dengan tempoh dagangan yang singkat ini sempena Chinese New Year? Ya.
Ya. Okey, kalau kita tengok FBM KSI pada hari Isnin, dia bermula dengan baik. Dia mencerminkan kenaikan pasaran global selepas pelantikan Trump. Optimisme terhadap dasar pro perniagaan dan juga peningkatan keadaan kecairan menyokong sentimen pelabur. Namun kenaikan ini tak bertahan lama, sebab kalau kita tengok pada hari Khamis dan juga hari Jumaat, ia yang berlaku aktiviti pengambilan untung yang menyebabkan indeks FBM KSI kurang berprestasi berbanding dengan indeks pasaran serantau. So prestasi yang kurang ini menunjukkan kebimbangan yang berterusan terhadap kemampuan Malaysia untuk menarik modal asing, terutama dengan aliran dana keluar asing yang berterusan daripada bursa Malaysia sejak beberapa bulan yang lalu. So selain itu, kita lihat kekurangan pembangkit domestik telah menjadikan pasaran tempatan lebih terdedah dengan pengaruh luaran. So berbalik kepada soalan tadi, bagaimana keadaan pada minggu ini, kita lihat pada minggu ini kalau kita tengok dia bukan 3 hari masa trading, dia sebenarnya 2,5 hari sebab pada esok adalah separuh hari saja untuk tempoh dagangan. So kita lihat aktiviti dagangan pada minggu ini dijangka kurang little bit suram disebabkan minggu dagangan yang dipendekkan berikutan dengan cuti tahun baru Cina. So jumlah dagangan dijangka berkurangan dengan kebanyakan pelabur mengambil pendekatan berhati-hati sementara menunggu keputusan mesyuarat Jawatankuasa Pasaran Terbuka Persekutuan FOMC, dan nada berhati-hati ini didominasikan saya boleh lihat akan mendominasikan pasaran dengan BMKSI dijangka bergerak dalam julat yang sempit, melainkan terdapat kejutan besar dalam acara global. Seperti kalau kita lihat FOMC meeting, sekiranya ada perubahan intonasi, ianya akan memberi impact positif kepada BMKSI.
Ya. Sidik, antara lain adalah China akan mengeluarkan data pembuatannya PMI pada hari ini. Mungkin bagaimana data ekonomi China mempengaruhi pasaran Malaysia pada minggu ini, Sidik?
Okey, kalau kita lihat China memang kekal sebagai pemacu utama sentimen untuk ekonomi dan juga pasaran saham di Malaysia kerana ia merupakan rakan dagang terbesar di Malaysia. Namun kalau kita tengok untuk minggu ini, data PMI China bagi Januari dijangkakan menunjukkan peningkatan sederhana kepada 50.3 yang menandakan kestabilan dalam sektor perindustrian. So kalau kita secara asasnya, apa-apa yang lebih tinggi daripada 50 ianya menunjukkan ekonomi sedang berkembang. Walaupun kita tengok China mengalami masalah dalam dasar monetary dan juga kesan daripada construction sektor yang berlaku, namun kita lihat sekiranya China kekal berada pada paras 50, ianya memberi petanda bahawa perindustrian dan juga ekonomi China akan berkembang. So kita lihat untuk bulan ni, untuk bulan Januari ini, ekonomi berada pada paras 50.3, lebih kurang dalam 50.3, dan pada hari ini juga kita lihat China PBOC juga akan menentukan kadar faedah 1 year medium term lending facility yang akan ditentukan, dan pada saya kadar MLF akan dijangka kekal pada 2% yang menunjukkan pihak berkuasa China lebih berhati-hati dalam mengimbangkan pertumbuhan dan risiko kewangan. So saya lihat untuk Malaysia untuk minggu ini ianya akan bergerak sedikit rendah kerana peniaga atau pelabur bersifat berhati-hati.
Ya, Sidik, satu lagi itu di China, tetapi di Amerika Syarikat FOMC 28-29 Januari ini, bagaimana keputusan itu mungkin akan mempengaruhi, keputusan The Fed mempengaruhi ringgit pertamanya dan juga mungkin kedua pasaran modal Malaysia itu?
Okey, kalau kita tengok dasar result Persekutuan Amerika Syarikat memberi impak kesan dalam aliran modal dan kestabilan kadar pertukaran. Tapi sebelum saya sentuh pada FOMC, pada minggu lepas BOJ telah meningkatkan kadar faedah, dan kenaikan kadar BOJ telah memberi impak positif kepada nilai mata wang dan juga di Asia dan juga nilai mata wang ringgit Malaysia. So kita lihat ianya mengurangkan tekanan terhadap ringgit berbanding dengan Amerika Syarikat. So kalau kita tengok untuk minggu ini, selepas BOJ menaikkan kadar faedah, ada pandangan menyatakan bahawa FOMC mungkin akan memberi gambaran untuk menyatakan bahawa terdapat 3 atau 4 kadar pemotongan di FOMC. Tapi pada minggu ini saya melihat FOMC berkemungkinan tidak akan menaikkan kadar faedah, tidak akan menurunkan kadar faedah, tetapi kita perlu lihat apa intipati FOMC tindak balas daripada dasar monetary yang dinyatakan oleh Trump dan juga Scott Bessent.
Ya. Itu cukup penting sekali kerana amanat yang diberikan oleh Trump kepada The Fed juga cukup besar. Mungkin akhir sekali dalam berbaki sekitar dalam 2 minit ini, apa bentuk risiko utama yang perlu diperhatikan oleh pelabur-pelabur Malaysia terutamanya dalam masa terdekat ini, Siddiq?
Okey, kalau saya lihat dia terdapat bukan satu saja risiko utama, terdapat 4 risiko utama, tapi kebanyakan ketiga risiko utama ini adalah daripada faktor luaran, iaitu yang pertama defisit fiskal Amerika Syarikat dan cabaran pembiayaan semula hutang kekal. Sebab kalau kita lihat Scott Bessent juga menyatakan bahawa mereka perlu meninggalkan ataupun mengeluarkan limit untuk hutang kerajaan, artinya tiada lagi limit hutang kerajaan. So terdapat kelonggaran untuk kerajaan Amerika Syarikat, khususnya FOMC, untuk bertindak balas. Yang kedua, ketidaktentuan dasar Amerika Syarikat di bawah pentadbiran Trump. Tapi kalau saya nyatakan seperti tadi, seperti yang pertama tadi saya cakap bahawa ketidaktentuan dasar dan dasar perdagangan Trump untuk penggal kedua dan berbanding dengan penggal pertama lebih tidak menentu berbanding dengan penggal pertama. So kita lihat ketidaktentuan dasar di bawah pentadbiran Trump mungkin sedikit better berbanding dengan penggal pertama. So yang ketiga, trajektori pemulihan ekonomi China yang kurang signifikan. So yang keempat yang saya lihat hanya yang berlaku untuk Malaysia, iaitu daya saing Malaysia untuk menarik modal asing. So 3 risiko utama yang disebabkan oleh faktor luaran dan hanya 1 risiko utama yang disebabkan faktor domestik.
Ya, baik. Siddiq, terima kasih atas perkongsian pandangan. Muhammad Siddiq Jantan, Ketua Penyidikan Pelaburan UOB Kehian Wealth Advisors, atas berkongsi pandangan beliau, dan sekali lagi akan kita rangkumkan di astrawani.com dan juga di semua platform digital Astrawani. Pencemaran plastik adalah masalah global besar dan dengan lebih daripada 8 juta tan plastik memasuki lautan setiap tahun, membahayakan lebih daripada 700 spesies hidupan liar. Manakala mikroplastik ditemui dalam air, makanan dan udara memberi kesan kepada kesihatan manusia. Global Plastic Action Partnership menggerakkan usaha membanteras penggunaan plastik berleluasa dan tidak dikitar semula. Cerita ini diangkat di World Economic Forum 2025.
Kelestarian menjadi tumpuan utama di World Economic Forum 2025 dan sudah pasti banyak isu dan topik berkait dengan kelestarian ini dan juga yang dekat di hati rakyat. Sebagai contoh, penggunaan plastik dan bagaimana kita menguruskan plastik di peringkat tempatan sendiri. Dan itu yang saya bincangkan pada episod kali ini. Saya berbesar hati, saya bersama dengan Clement Smith, iaitu Director of the Global Plastic Action Partnership. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Despite the growing awareness and also international commitments, plastic production and also pollution continue to rise in that sense. So what are the biggest barriers, do you think, in achieving tangible results and also progress in terms of addressing this crisis?
I think what's really important is to recognize the role of each stakeholders,
Right.
which is what from a Global Plastic Action Partnership we're doing at the national level as well as at the global level, is really bring at the table government, businesses, civil society and local community to take solutions together. First, take stock on what's happening, but then also define concrete action that each stakeholder can take at the same time.
Yeah, and also many countries around the globe, have introduced basically the ban on the single-use plastics. But in terms of implementation, also execution is quite inconsistent in certain countries and certain areas. But how can global initiatives like yours, for instance, ensure that this kind of policies lead to the real impact?
So I think it would be on twofold. The first step at the national level, working, as I mentioned, with different stakeholders, including the government, so we can define what's the right enabling policy framework to enable the industry to transform, and in that context, what are the different elements of that policy that can help move to a circular economy. And then afterwards, it's about joining a broader collaboration. So from a Global Plastic Action Partnership, we've announced this week that we reach our vision to support 25 countries by 2025 to take action against plastic pollution. And in that context, there is therefore this group of 25 countries that have similar definitions, similar way of measurement, and therefore can take more synergized action that will amplify the national policies.
Yeah. You mentioned a lot about stakeholders. I want to talk about the private sector as well, because at the end of the day, private sector plays a major role in plastic production as well. So do you think that the voluntary commitments from corporations are enough currently, and are we on the right track in terms of that? And is there a need to stricter global regulations?
So I think the voluntary commitments are a starting point, and I think it's great to see the private sector showing what's possible. From the Global Plastic Action Partnership, we work with different businesses to issue a report that's called the Circular Industry Solution Report that shows the type of solutions that are already existing and that have the potential to scale. So we're hoping that this can also help not only industries but also government to understand what's possible and what innovation can drive in order to move to circular economy.
Right. And many corporations also promote sustainability initiatives around the globe, I would say, including the South Global countries as well. But how does your organization, for instance, tackle the greenwashing elements of it? Because you don't want people to just say that they do this kind of things, but at the end of the day, there's no tangible results to it.
So what's really important when we're working with the different stakeholders, including the private sector as the Global Plastic Action Partnership, is we really focus, as our name says, on action.
Yeah.
So obviously we do need to have some discussions in order to drive an understanding and drive this roadmap, but we really focus on making tangible and concrete action on the ground with the local community and really focusing on the actions that are driving the most impact.
What are some of the cases that you could share with us? The best example or best practices that your organization find in any countries?
So I think at the best practices level is obviously when the different parties talk to each other and when there is a broader coordination at the center of the government. So I will mention a country like Ecuador, for example, where 3 ministries are working hand in hand together with the rest of the network in order to really drive a change that not only focuses on environmental impact from the Ministry of the Environment, but also tackle the industry and the local impact and also the foreign affairs, so that it's also encompassed into the position of the country in the global negotiations.
Let's talk about the innovation and also technology in this particular issue. What role do you think emerging technologies play, such as AI and also advanced recycling techniques, for instance, in combating plastic waste? How can we scale these innovations globally?
No, it's a great question. So I think what's really important to realize is plastic waste doesn't have to be a problem. It can be an opportunity and it can become a feedstock. And to make it a feedstock, it's an emerging market, but the role of technology is going to be paramount. First, at the production, at the starting point of it, in order to make sure that we're designing products that are better suited for a circular economy. But then afterwards, obviously, how do you retain the material into the economy if you want to avoid the leakage, and really focus on those technologies and those really advanced AI technologies that will enable us to sort, to collect in a better way, so we get a material that has a stronger value as an output.
Yeah, and also the bioplastic. Bioplastic is always marketed as as a solution to the conventional plastic usage, but of course they pose another challenges as well. But do you think that it is a sustainable alternative to what the current plastic usage that we are using currently?
So first, when we talk about bioplastic, we need to differentiate what we are talking about. So we have bio-based plastic, which will be plastic which are non-fossil fuel based, or we have biodegradable plastic. And you can have a combination of any of those four, so it's very important to understand what we are talking about. In the case of alternative material, alternative materials can be a viable solution to plastic pollution. So it's important to look at the innovation in that direction. But it doesn't change the fact that if you want to move from a linear economy to a circular economy, independently of the materials, you need to find solution to collect that material and to sort that material. And as such, it is not going to be a silver bullet to move from one material to another if you don't have the supporting systems that is going to be there. So I think I want to say you need to look at a system that can enable multiple materials like we already have today, independently of the bio or not, and really build that system so we can retain all this material into the economy.
Let's talk about the challenges faced by the developing countries, especially. If you could share with us as well, what are some of the challenges by developing countries, especially as compared to developed countries, in terms of, managing the plastic waste and also plastic usage as well?
Well, I would say the first thing that comes to my mind is the lack of infrastructure.
Right.
And obviously the need to start from scratch and to build an infrastructure, which we know is a capital-intensive exercise, and also something that is spread across different actors in the chain. You obviously have the private sector and the government. This we mentioned already at a high level. But if you go a level deeper, you also have, like, the waste management is often left at the level of the city, sometimes even at the level of the district, not at the national level. So how do you break down into this chain and really get to the actors that have the expertise and that have the needs, and how do you enable them to actually build those systems?
Yeah. But how do you see the progress, globally, about 10 years ago, right now, and 10 years down the road?
Someone said this week, I heard, if you want, the more backward you can look is the more forward you can look as well. So it's really interesting, but I think it won't apply in that specific case. I think there has been a really radical change. I think we reach a tipping point in terms of awareness raising. More and more people are aware that plastic pollution is an environmental threat, but also a threat to our society, to our well-being, and also to our health. So we've seen this, and we've seen the commitment and the willingness of many different actors, including governments, to change, which has been translated into the global negotiation for a plastic treaty that have been going on in 2 years, which is a light speed in the timeline of the United Nations process.
Right.
And I think if we're looking in 10 years down the road, we are now at a moment where it seems like a big mountains, and it might seem that we don't know where we're going, but I know we have the resources among the different actors to actually start that journey together, identify the first steps and the solution, and really make progress. We see a lot of willingness among the developing countries you were mentioning to really find solution to the problem, and more individuals and local communities also voluntarily starting that work.
Yeah, you mentioned, my last question, you mentioned about the awareness from all the stakeholders, but in terms of the consumer, especially in the developing countries, as well as developed countries as well. But how do you see the different right now in terms of consumers' awareness to the plastic usage or single plastic usage?
So obviously awareness level will be dependent on each of the countries, and also to the access that each individual will have to the information. So the work we're doing is really to try to cascade down as much as possible this learning and this understanding of the issue, which is one thing, but more importantly on the solution and what needs to happen. And we're talking there into system change, and also in terms of change of behavior for all of us, which is something that takes time. But this is also something that you'll see coming also from the ground up.
All right, thank you so much, Clemens, for joining us. All the best with your effort and also initiatives. Itu adalah berkaitan dengan penggunaan plastik. Kalau di Malaysia, kita tahu dah sekarang ni ada ramai tak guna plastik, ramai guna paper bag untuk ke pasaraya dan sebagainya. Itu consumer, tetapi penggunaan di peringkat swasta dan kerajaan juga memainkan peranan yang penting. Ini harus kita lihat dengan lebih teliti. Sekian sahaja laporan saya dari World Economic Forum untuk Niaga AWANI.
dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Cara kita mendapat berita kian berubah. Melalui media sosial maupun saluran digital yang lain serta kaca TV. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini.
Kita buat sesuatu yang berbeza.
Teraskan acuan verifikasi yang diamalkan supaya setiap fakta adalah sahih. Daripada analisis pelbagai sudut yang mendalam, laporan-laporan khas dan perbincangan yang membina negara. Inklusif, suara rakyat kami ajukan. Keseimbangan persepsi kami pastikan. Kerana setiap cerita mempunyai impak yang tersendiri dan perlu dibawa dengan penelitian yang terperinci. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada. Saluran berita paling dipercayai di Malaysia.
Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now, today on Analysis, we're discussing data centers and ecological impact. So, it has been a fast-paced week of climate-related headlines. The ongoing World Economic Forum, WEF, in Davos released the Global Risk Report 2025. Now, this is the forum's annual survey of chief risk officers, and it actually highlighted extreme weather events as the second biggest risk in terms of severity over the next 2 years and the biggest risk to come for the coming 10 years. Meanwhile, in the United States, Donald Trump is ushered into the White House and on his first day in office pulls the US out of the Paris Climate Accords again, cancels the Biden administration's Green New Deal and also gives the green light for increased drilling for fossil fuels, declaring that the US has, quote-unquote, the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we are going to use it, end quote. Meanwhile, ASEAN and our collective population of 683 million, and with Malaysia as ASEAN chair this year, is committed to a climate-resilient future. It's at this timely juncture which we take a deep dive into data centers and ecological impact. So, to paint the big picture, the Malaysian Investment Development Authority, MIDA, approved 12 data center projects worth 90.2 billion ringgit from 2021 to June 2024, which translates into billions of dollars in investments, driven by the growing demand for AI as well as cloud computing. However, this growth raises environmental concerns. Data centers do require substantial energy, and Malaysia's energy mix, still reliant on fossil fuels, contributes to higher carbon emissions. The big question now is, can Malaysia meet our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario via renewable energy and improved efficiency if data center investments and infrastructure continue expanding? Niaga Spotlight today focuses on evaluating the ecological cost of data center FDIs and strategies to reduce this negative climate impact. Dr. Gary William Teixeira, Adjunct Associate Professor at the Asia School of Business, and Kuwei Yang, Research Associate at Khazanah Research Institute, join me now live in the studios for this extremely timely discussion. A very good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for making time.
Good morning, Tamina.
Fantastic. So perhaps I could open out the conversation by asking you, Gary, how can Malaysia's data center industry now balance this increasing demand for digital infrastructure? It's fantastic. We're getting all of this FDI. It's going to come to fruition. But we also have our 2050 net zero commitments. So we're right in the middle here. Where do we go from here?
Well, there's no doubt that having these data centers are a value proposition for the country, not just from the revenue that they will earn, but for the benefits, social benefits, the quality of life benefits for Malaysians themselves. So this is something we need to look at. It actually improves the efficiency with which we Malaysians live our lives. The issue really is, what are the surrounding agreements that come with the hosting of these data centers, particularly in terms of the energy that is going to be needed for running the data center and for cooling the data center. So the idea is, are these plans to plant up data centers in line with or commensurate with the growth in renewable energy resources that we have in terms of our policies like NETR And implementing this in a balanced manner is then going to be the issue. Can we source additional renewable energy to the level that we need so that as we plant up these data centers, they can actually depend more and more on renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuel electricity?
Absolutely. I appreciate the fact that you've helped to set out the broader landscape, but digging just a little bit deeper into that. So let's talk a little more about energy mix when it comes to Malaysia. Now, globally overall, data centers are contributing currently to roughly about 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, as we call them in short. Malaysia's energy mix is reliant anywhere between 45 to perhaps even closer to 50% on coal, which is, of course, a fossil fuel. So what has the picture been looking like, and what progress has been made in 2024, Gary, with all the stakeholder discussions which have been happening, as well as what is currently being implemented for the year ahead?
Well, the NETR, as we know it now, the Energy Transition Plan, actually does contain a work direction that moving away from coal and moving towards gas as the transition fuel. As we know, gas as an electricity source has about half the emissions of coal, but it still does not. It still results in emissions that need to be dealt with, unlike renewable energy, and you may count in that renewable energy hydroelectricity, you may count solar, and increasingly you may count things like biomass and biogas, because as a country at the equator, we really need to look to our strengths, and both from the natural resource areas that we have, as well as our agricultural products, we do find that we have fairly copious amounts of biomass that we can tap into for this purpose. Some have mentioned energy from waste, but I think that that's an area that we should tread very, very carefully on.
That's right.
Since part of the waste is plastic waste, and that comes from petrochemicals as well. So it is a fossil fuel if you are doing waste energy from plastics.
So biomass definitely is something that is easily accessible and at the same time exploitable without too many downside risks. All right, well heard on that. Thanks so much for that. Now, coming into me moving to Wei Yang. Now, Wei Yang, tell us a little bit about the recent research article which you've authored by Khazanah Research Institute, and what was the overall thought process about putting that out in this point in time. And it's very crucial, of course, adding to the discourse that is growing around the subject about responsible and sustainable investments for data centers.
Well, the article was meant as a short piece to spark conversations around the environmental impact of data centers, because as we see, a lot of this investment coming in may or may not be assessed or being as transparent. And we see there are many economic opportunities of that are claimed to be brought in by data centers, but there are also things that we have to look closer at, especially on the downsides, and we want to see whether the risk that data centers can brought onto both our ecology and as well as our functioning of our energy system, whether those can balance out the benefits that they brought in. So, yeah, so.
Absolutely. So that is it in a nutshell. However, now let's move into how Malaysia can look at developing then and implementing also, very importantly, impactful climate policies that will specifically then address this growing energy consumption of data centers. We're already in 2025. To meet some of our targets by 2030, what can be done already this year?
Yeah. Well, one thing to know about data centers, and as we all know, data centers uses a lot of energy. Some of the larger ones, like hyperscale data centers, can use anywhere between 20 to hundreds of megawatts. The larger ones even use enough power to power up a whole small city. Data centers are also qualitatively different in their energy usage because they have to operate around the clock.
Very true. It's a 24/7, 365 kind of scenario. So no breaks at all.
Definitely there will be implications on our power system, no doubt. But right now, the industry standard metric for sustainability and performance is what we call a power usage effectiveness, PUE. And this is an this is an efficiency measure that measures how much energy that feeds the data center actually goes into power the computing resource alone, which is called the IT load. And the closer your facility is to 1 PUE, the more efficient you are. But we have to bear in mind that this is an internal efficiency measure. It tells us nothing about the ecological impacts, how much emissions these energy use entail, where these energy sources come from. And the emphasis on using efficiency as a sustainability metric also has its own implications, because we know that the efficiency improvements over the past decade has been matched by the increased demand, computing demand, and this has kept the energy use level around 1% globally. But the recent trend of AI, especially large language models, which was unforeseen just less than a decade ago, actually would buck this trend up because of the sheer amount of energy it uses in their training and inference phase. So we're saying that some estimates already said that like AI-powered Google searches actually uses 9 times more energy than traditional Google searches. And as more AI companies are rushing to integrate AI into their services, we would expect to see more of these traditional energy usage being amplified.
Exactly, and I'd just like to also point out, you made a really interesting fact there, and this was something which was trending a little bit on social media just in the first weeks of January, the fact that actually when you look into a Google search today, it automatically actually gives you an AI outcome. Yes. So unless you specifically go in and request for it to be minus AI, you're actually going to be inadvertently always using AI if you're using Google, right?
But coming back to what it meant, what this would mean for the national climate policy and as well as other energy policies especially, this is also a problem of managing common pool resource. Because data centers, they come in, they are also sharing the utility with millions of other users, including low-income households, low-band consumers like you and I, and who rely on the grid for their day-to-day energy use. So there is a genuine risk that these large energy users would lead to an imbalance in the power system. And at times of crisis, especially as energy transition is picking up pace, in times of crisis, which is there is a non-zero chance of a power failure happening when you have high imbalances in the power system. In such times when the utility has to make a decision between saving certain people and cutting off certain people, this what is known as an under-frequency load shedding. Those decisions of whose energy security it is to prioritize would be very critical. And I think policy has to come in at the intersection of this and say that, oh, there are certain social bottom line that we cannot cross, and put in safeguards and cushion the effects on lower marginalized, vulnerable groups that uses the same energy as those larger users.
Absolutely. What is really standing out to me is the fact that regulatory measures need to be able to sort of balance incentivizing energy efficiency without stifling that technological growth. And just to draw that broader landscape, because that's also a statistic that stood out to me, the recent California wildfires, which of course were covered widely in news. Now, an interesting point to note is that California, the entire state alone, it actually has about 50 data centers over there. Johor, for example, closer to home, about 52 data centers, both in plan as well as those who are already operational. Selangor, we are close to 30 data centers. So once again, talking about the mix and, of course, the usage of water, especially as a critical cooling agent. So much to actually go through. Thanks very much for that, Wei Yang. Right, Gary, now moving into looking at the context of Malaysia's evolving climate policies. Netter, as you've already briefly touched upon. So how can now data centers adopt energy-efficient technologies? Let's dig a little deeper into the science, as well as some of the renewable energy sources without disproportionately increasing their operational costs, because that, of course, will be key to whether or not we're going to see vast adoption and resistance to any directives by regulatory bodies?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Now, that is a big question because it pulls together a number of different areas. First of all, if you're talking about the energy source in the first place, we are in a process where we are transitioning away from coal. We're transitioning more towards gas. At the same time, we are planting up as much solar PV as possible, while trying to maximize the use of the power generation from all of our hydroelectric facilities. There's not that many of them on the peninsular side, but certainly, of course, the area for growth of data centers you haven't mentioned yet is Sarawak. So that's sort of the third area apart from KL, to some extent Penang, but the big growth is Johor and now those areas. So you need to generate electricity efficiently, you need to dispatch it efficiently, and you also need to, once again, look at the data centers themselves, which have undergone, in the last 10 years even, the method of cooling, from cooling the entire building to actually cooling the chips themselves.
Yes, the hub itself.
The hub itself. So we're looking at quantum increases in the efficiency of cooling, but as Wei Yang has pointed out, that has sort of kept pace with the growth in demand. So it's been fairly flat. The idea really is that in terms of the additional policies, what it is that we need are the technologies that Petronas is looking into now, for example, not using water, but using different types of non-water coolants, to cool some of these things down. They've collaborating with other companies that develop different types of coolants that are suitable for use in these sorts of data centers as energy carriers to cool the systems down. There are fringe benefits as well, even as we are competing for electricity use with the general public. And as Yang very importantly pointed out, there is a hierarchy of whom you disenfranchise first. Exactly. Obviously, infrastructure, hospitals, pumping stations for water,
critical public services,
communication services. All of these things will require that they be very high on the priority list, and you might find that it's other types of industries that end up paying the price for some of these things, and perhaps part of the population. But I think that there's huge scope for new areas of growth for renewable energy sources, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to biomass. And even there's a broad range. You have direct combustion, which is very inefficient and produces a lot of pollution. And there are newer gasification technologies, pyrolysis technologies, and biochar, for example, policies that you can use. You can extract syngas from biomass. You can extract some liquid, usable liquids from them, and then the remainder is biochar, which is, which avoids the carbon dioxide cycles. You're heating it in the absence of oxygen. You don't get carbon dioxide, you get carbon. And, at worst case scenario, it's a fuel, it's a biofuel.
That's right.
But best case scenario, as a carbon capture and storage mechanism, and in Malaysia are putting the act together right now for carbon capture, use and storage, you can entomb this biochar in concrete. You can apply it to agricultural soils. There are a number of other uses, and the methodologies already exist with certification agencies like Verra for using biochar to sequester carbon and to store carbon in this way. And this is atmospheric carbon that we're putting away. So in the situation, somewhat unwanted perhaps, that we end up using more gas, it's still a fossil fuel. Those emissions can actually be offset to some degree by extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in this high density form.
So there are options that are already on the table. And when it comes to the government harmonizing it from their side, what are your thoughts on the government's recent green tax incentives for energy efficient industries? Do you feel that is actually going to help with encouraging this shift without too much of significant financial strain?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. You know, the ministries, to their credit, have been communicating more with each other.
Sure.
We, of course, have NRES, which we need to be in there. The Ministry of Communications and Multimedia needs to be in there. Petra, managing our energy supply, needs to be in there. Even ministries like MITI that are involved in bringing in the investment and keeping track of, you know, sort of what the conditions are for these investments. These investments come in partially because our energy costs are low, but they also come in because they expect a certain amount of renewable energy in that, and they expect continued progress towards lower carbon energy generation, and they in fact require that all of the sustainability criteria, whether they are social criteria, whether they're environmental criteria, now need to be filled, especially as we move into a global standard for reporting on sustainability.
Absolutely, especially as standards get not only, I would say, stricter, but a little more transparent as well. And of course, that brings up the opportunity for partnering with renewable energy providers. And would there be a chance for also solar energy to actually play a bigger role when it comes to the renewable energy mix, given that, well, when we looked at 2022, our solar energy potential was estimated at roughly 17,000 megawatts or so. Just given the fact that we are, you know, the land of almost continuous sunshine, wouldn't it also make sense to simultaneously expand that together with biomass?
Absolutely. It's a no-brainer. If I'm going to put in a data center, which is essentially a large building like a warehouse with a flat roof,
yes.
Okay, it just makes perfect sense to coat as much of that surface as possible with solar to try to defray the cost of energy for that building. The issue is that the energy density coming from solar, if you were to compare it to hydroelectricity, or you compare it to biomass or waste to energy, and particularly if you compare it to nuclear, the energy density is fairly low. And so just to power the data center, you need not just that roof, but, you know, several square kilometers perhaps around that same building to be plastered with solar panels at the current level of efficiency that they're running at, of course. And we're constantly pushing the boundary on the efficiency of solar panels as well. We need to think about that as well and plan it into the future. So, you know, growth in efficiency is something that we can plan for. At the same time, we need to plan for increases in demand. And you know, concurrently, expectations for the quality of the services and products that we deliver to fulfill sustainability requirements at the same time, ESG requirements, etc.
Exactly. So overall, what I'm gathering is that, you know, on one hand, you've got the cost-effective, sustainable power source quandary, but it also needs to meet somewhere halfway with the fact that ought there to be a cap for looking at Malaysia's ecological landscape and how many more data center projects, for example, we are able to accept. A couple of really key issues.
Yeah, there are examples out there. You know, very recently, Singapore put a moratorium on data centers between, I believe it was 2019 and 2023, something like that. And when they decided that they were able to continue with the process, then they lifted the moratorium. So there's you know, something to be said about being able to have that avenue for your planning. It's not, you know, once we put something down, people were committed and were locked in.
And it's unlimited.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Gary. So we'll come back into the discussion right after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us right here on Niaga Spotlight.
Merentasi Laut Cina Selatan hingga ke puncak Kinabalu, kami bawakan laporan ringkas, padat dan komprehensif. 5 minit Awani Sabah Plus setiap Khamis dan Jumaat 8.25 malam hanya di Astro Awani.
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. Still with me, Tamina Kausji. And today, of course, we are continuing the discussion on data centers and ecological impact with our guests live in the studio. Gary, thanks very much for those points that you made there, particularly on the expansion of data centers and about the potential cap. Also being cognizant of the fact that because of Singapore's moratorium, that's also what increased the outflow and the FDI investment into Johor, the next closest landing point, which has soared to about 52 data centers in all. Wei Yang, now integrating the conversation with a couple of perspectives of Malaysia's commitment to achieving our carbon neutral target by 2050, what are some thoughts that you have around specific climate policy frameworks that can actually be introduced to, of course, once again, ensure that this expansion of data centers is not going to be undermining our carbon emission goals?
So in terms of emissions reduction target, our internationally pledged target is to reach a carbon intensity of 45% below the 2005 level by 2030. The carbon neutrality and net zero emissions by 2050 is something that informed domestic policymaking but has not made it to international pledges yet. So that would be a bit more immediate than the 2050 target. But it doesn't mean it's not important. So because the emissions, the target that we have set for ourselves is in terms of carbon intensity, it is actually a quotient of emissions against GDP. So it's a relative measure and it doesn't really indicate absolute emission reduction. We gave ourselves a little bit more flexibility that way. The way to hit those targets is to always keep your GDP growth, your denominator larger than your emissions growth. So when talking about data centers, we have to take into account the carbon intensity of these facilities as well. But the carbon intensity of data centers are dependent on their scope 2 emissions, which is their connection to the grid, the power utility. And the ability for these data centers to meet net zero emissions, take your target, is entirely dependent on how fast we can transition away from fossil fuel-based power generation, as well as our performance in carbon sink conservation in Malaysia. And it is one of the issues is that it is unclear whether our energy transition planning has taken into account of the data centers' energy demand forecast when they're doing it. So, but then in other countries, you have seen that the surge in data centers industry have already made their previous energy demand forecast completely obsolete. So
we could take a couple of lessons from there, right?
Yes.
Perhaps could we be looking at carbon emission caps for data centers? Would that perhaps be a useful parameter whereby which to proceed?
Well, exactly the point, because data centers themselves rely on the power grid that they're connected to reach the emissions target. So one way that they can sort of hit those targets without the performance of our energy transition is that they use something we call an energy attribute. RECs, renewable energy certificates. These actually allow the data center operators to buy claims that they have used renewable energy and therefore offset their scope 2 emissions. But in reality, they are using the same power source that comes from our grid, which is at around 70 to 80% fossil fuel. And so this is essentially accounting problem, because the corporate accounting process and the national carbon accounting process are different in their approaches, and it is essentially keeping two tabs. And you have you can have a situation where the corporate the data center is saying that, oh, we have already reached carbon neutrality, but the national account, which is reported by our government to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in our biannual report, our national GHG inventory, you can have the national account still counting those emissions produced by the power utility itself. So there needs to be a harmonization there needs to be bridging of those different accounting processes. And one way to do that would be we need more accounting transparency using a harmonized carbon accounting framework nationally and corporate, perhaps using something like a residual grid mix emissions reporting. Legislatively, that would mean that we might need climate change. We might need an act that that require these standards, but we also have to bear in mind that making carbon accounting and reporting mandatory can be a strain on small businesses, and as well as setting off another set of problems in all the cases.
Most certainly. But of course, bringing it back into policies, perhaps, would it make sense to enforce a policy requiring data centers to source a certain percentage, let's say 30% of their energy from renewables by 2030? Because that might also help to harmonize in line with Malaysia's target to achieve about 31% of our renewable energy for total electricity mix by 2025. And that's this year, right?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose we could try to align those proportions,
right,
so that as we grow, as I mentioned, our supply of renewable electricity, which is scope 2, as you mentioned, for the data centers, we can actually then comply with perhaps some of these directives, and they may come from the investors themselves, or we may actually require them from our own policies and regulations. And regulations are where it's at precisely. We have the Securities Commission now coming up with the National Sustainability Reporting Frameworks. And these actually do require public listed companies that are generating over 200 billion ringgit in revenue to actually begin submitting reports this year in 2025. For public listed companies below that level, they need to begin submitting these reports next year. And for non-public listed companies, as long as you're over 200 billion ringgit, you still have to begin reporting, I think it's 2027. And it's a window that you have. You can begin reporting only scope 1 and scope 2, but eventually by the end of the window, 2 years from now, 2025 to 2027, if you're a large public listed company with a high revenue, you need to be reporting all 3 scopes. But as you mentioned, the key scope here is scope 2, purchased energy, purchased electricity. Central Bank has been very, very clear, very transparent, and very forward with this. The JC3 together, Central Bank and the Securities Commission, aligning the reporting requirements. And as Asia School of Business, we are the training arm of Central Bank.
That's right.
Our ties and collaboration with MIT have actually given us some of the tools that we're currently helping the private sector out to utilize these tools, even as the central bank imposes requirements and regulations on the banking industry. The data centers don't exist in a vacuum. They exist
naturally.
in an ecosystem.
It's an entire ecosystem.
Right? So there's going to be a lot of CapEx, there's going to be a lot of OpEx that Malaysian companies, and I'm sure that when we have these investments, we require a certain amount of local content. Jobs for Malaysians, products and services provided by Malaysia in the construction, planning, construction, operation, maintenance of these facilities. All of these things need to be part of that ecosystem and need to are necessarily stimulated, enabled, facilitated by the banking regulations and the financial regulations as well. So we'll find that there are a whole suite of sectors that involved in the support and the running of these data centers. So it's not just energy and water that we need to look at. It's the social aspects, the workforce, etc. that need to be. And this is where the training comes in. And I'm sure you'll be moving into that as well. But all these things are really big picture scenarios that we need to look at. And we need to get down in some detail if we are to understand them, plan for the risks, and then manage the risks.
Very true. Planning for the risks and then managing the risks, of course, and the further role, perhaps, Gary, which the Malaysian government could be playing in creating regulatory frameworks or even furthering the incentive structures. Your thoughts on that? And Malaysia is also in a at a very interesting juncture where we've just taken on stewardship of ASEAN as the chair. What are the opportunities here to not only look at how we are going to set up our ecosystem for comprehensive and sustainable FDI investments for data centers, but perhaps even setting an example for the entire region?
It works both ways. As chair of ASEAN in this go-around, I think lots of opportunities for increasing the amount of collaboration between our ASEAN member states. As you know, we already have interconnections between Singapore and Malaysia, Malaysia and Thailand in terms of electricity. That's something certainly that we can grow as the renewable energy industry grows in our neighbors as well. Thailand also ramping up RE production. If they have a surplus, etc., we are already selling electricity to Singapore. There are plans for accessing an interconnection between Sumatra and Peninsular Malaysia as well. There's talk of coming from Kalimantan and Sarawak across to Singapore and others. And even if you follow some of the longest range energy transfers from Northern Australia moving to Singapore. So, some of these costs are very, very high. But once again, as the climate imperative becomes more and more important, then what we will find is that the cost of inaction, of not accessing these collaborations with our ASEAN neighbors is actually going to be overshadowed by the fact that we as ASEAN and as a region of the world that's particularly vulnerable and exposed to climate impacts end up spending more and more resources on combating loss and damage rather than channeling these into adaptation and low energy and high efficiency power generation. So as a collection of countries, I think that this presents a unique opportunity. There are countries that are high consumers of energy. There are countries that have very, very large agro industries that produce a lot of organic waste that can actually be put into RE production. So I think it's a golden opportunity, and I think all the ASEAN leaders know this, particularly with respect to the fact that regardless of what President Trump does, in the end, we are going to be in a situation where we can more effectively use our resources if we share them. So electricity is something that is difficult to store, expensive to store. We have battery storage. But if we can dispatch it to where it's needed, if we have surpluses, then we'll find that the entire region is going to benefit from a higher efficiency of use of these resources.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't think of a more collaborative approach and a topic to start on than this when it comes to ASEAN actually sharing resources. Thanks very much, Gary. Wei Yang, now digging a little deeper into how can KRI's findings then be perhaps leveraged to create a more data-driven and also performance-based regulatory environment, especially so that data centers can remain operational while minimizing ecological impacts. We're talking about those extreme weather conditions. We've, of course, experienced a spate of continuing flash flood impacts that these days, as compared to even, let's say, 5 to 6 years ago, are affecting multiple states across Malaysia, right? So this is just one example of perhaps a dire emergency case scenario.
Just want to harken back to what Dr. Gary had said about it's related, the ecosystem around data centers, and they do not exist in a vacuum because data centers essentially are part of a larger socio-ecological system. And so like any other economic activities, it uses economic resources, common pooled resources that are also used by other actors within the system. And they are certainly very important for a lot of ecological functions, like water would be important when we see when we see risk of droughts. So they are also important for building social resilience against climate impact in a sense. But data centers, they differ in that they use disproportionately more of these resources than other activities. Right now, with climate impacts, we sort of have to assume that they will continue, even regardless of the global temperature, because even if we hold the global temperature at a certain level, the long lifetime of carbon emissions in the atmosphere and their influence towards the climate system can actually still impose climate impacts on society long after we have held the temperature steady at 1.5, for example. So we have to assume the worst and plan accordingly, and that means to have cross-sectoral collaboration and looking at things more holistically, especially when international actors right now are unreliable to
but that's all right.
Contribute.
ASEAN as a collective actor has a lot more market share and also population. And we're double, triple almost.
Our other trading partners, for example, Australia, EU, Japan, Korea, as far as we know, they're still fairly well committed to the issue of sustainability. Some of them are very highly impacted by climate events.
Exactly. 2024 was a record year for climate impacts, hottest year on record as well, right? Yes, Wei Yang.
So as for whether there is a policy framework or regulatory environment that would be feasible for this sort of cross-sectoral planning, it really needs to take into account of different sectors. Like the energy planning needs to go hand in hand with water sector management, needs to go hand in hand with land use planning. And a lot of times these are separate jurisdictions. But they are functionally interconnected. So there needs to be a national strategy. A high-level national strategy would be very important when it comes to providing a vision and a traceable target and a pathway towards climate resilient development. So for KRI, we have in the just past year produced a report that looks deeper at these issues on certainly national climate strategy, climate justice, adaptation governance that provides like a holistic view on things and landscaping. So that would be my interest of the audience.
All right. Thanks very much for that, Wei Yang. And Gary, moving into getting some key points about how data center operators themselves can possibly integrate climate resilience strategies into their design and operational models so that they are playing their part as well for ensuring long-term sustainability while minimizing business interruptions.
Yes, so once again, when it comes to cutting-edge technologies, there are a lot of proposals out there. So one of those is actually using non-water coolants.
That's right.
There are other options depending on where the data center is sited. If it's sited perhaps within an industrial park, then perhaps there is actually a need for heated water, from a data center that can actually be sold to a neighboring factory or industry or something like that can utilize the fact that this water is actually above ambient temperature and will actually need less energy to heat if hot water or steam is what is needed. So the idea really is, about the circular economy, about integrating needs and thinking about the waste products, not so much as waste, but as other kinds of resources that can actually be capitalized upon. And this idea of having peers and having a peer-to-peer network to move these things back and forth. For example, if the factory next door is perhaps a wood products factory, perhaps they have wood waste, perhaps they have their own boiler, generate their own steam, perhaps they're a self-generating electricity plant as well, and many of the industrial parks and factories do have, indeed, generate their own electricity. They can't operate without a surplus.
Definitely.
So the idea then that recently the Tenaga Nasional has actually endorsed this idea of peer-to-peer sharing of energy means that then data centers, perhaps as part of an ecosystem of other types of industries, can begin sharing information back and forth. I mean, it's not limited in that scale if you are located next to a neighborhood, for example, and and people go to work every day. Their houses are actually dormant. The only thing that's probably running is the fridge and the internet. All right, and they have rooftop solar. Perhaps the idea is that those can actually go back to the grid and just take a short hop over to the data center, for example. So the concept of integration and circular economy actually do come together in this space. And you actually have to be creative in thinking about it. It's not as if there aren't barriers to these things. Some of these are safety barriers, some are practicality barriers. But in the end, if we have a focus and once again, we are supported both from a technological aspect as well as from a financial aspect, we can actually begin getting these things on the ground. From the financing side, certainly banks are far more open nowadays.
That's right.
They've hired and brought on board their own suite of experts in the fields of chemical engineering, the fields of electrical engineering, because they themselves are now under requirements from central bank to assess all of these OPEX and CAPEX loans.
That's right.
Yeah.
Dr. Gary, thank you so very much for that really comprehensive roundup of, the direction into which we're heading, and Wei Yang, for all your insights regarding how the ecological impact needs to be framed from a much wider picture, not just data centers alone. It's been an excellent discussion, and thank you very much for making the time today.
Thank you, Samina. It's a pleasure.
Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. Wishing everyone a productive week ahead. I'm Tamina Kausji signing off for now. We'll see you again next Friday with more economic analysis and insights.